very warm welcome to Brand Equity with me, Sonali Krishna. First off, from the entire team of Brand Equity, we wish you a very happy new year. Now, as we kickstart our first episode in 2022, we thought, why not look back at the year gone by with candid lens and at the same time also peep into the new year to get a sense of what awaits us. And who better than Martin Sorrell, the founder and executive chairman of S4 Capital, who's seen the best and worst of times, to give us an inkling of what the future beholds. So without further ado, let me welcome my guest for today, Martin Sorrell. Thank you so much for joining us right here, and a very happy new year to you.
Happy New Year to you, Sonali, and to all your viewers, listeners, and everybody in India.
It's been an interesting 2021. We've seen a lot of reports that have suggested that this has been a record year in terms of, for the industry. How would you, define the year that's gone by?
If you look at the 2-year stack for the industry, and I think we have to look at two industries, Sonali. There's the traditional industry and the digital industry. You cover both, and unfortunately they get lumped together, but they are two very different nations or countries or cities. It's a tale of two cities. The traditional industry has had a bounce back because of the fiscal and monetary stimulus post-COVID, quite rightly. Governments around the world, including India and China and everywhere else, have poured money into the economy, about $16 trillion in a comparison to a $93 trillion GDP economy of the world as a whole. They poured that money in for recovery and to maintain employment and the social fabric of their countries. The governments have done with their countries in order to maintain economic, some level of economic prosperity, if not prosperity, certainly carrying on. That has masked what has really gone on in our industry. So you had a dire 2020. I mean, the CEOs of the holding companies were faced with their worst ever performance in 2020. And in 2021, they boast of their best ever performance. But even then, that you have to put that in comparison to 2020. So they're really even Steven over the 2 years, maybe up 2 or 3 or 4% over that 2-year stack. In 2021, digital grew by about 30%. We at S4 in the first 9 months had grown by 47%, like for like, excluding deals, including deals we doubled in size. And then we've seen that continue through October and November and into the end of the year at the same or even stronger rates. So digital has continued to be very strong at around 30% in 2021, with traditional around 10 and the overall industry up about 20%. And as I say, the holding companies only managed to grow by 10%, which basically means they've lost share. Now, turning to 2022, it will probably be another very good year for the digital part of the industry. We're looking at growth, we think, for the digital industry of around 15 to 20%, and traditional maybe around 5 to 10. So overall, the industry, including digital and traditional, will be up about 10 to 15%. So another good year driven by GDP growth.
If I asked you to look at 2021, not juxtapose it with 2020 as it was an abnormal year, but juxtapose it with 2019, how do you think the industry fared?
If you compare it to 2019, that 2-year stack, there's just been if you look at the traditional part of the industry, there's been very limited growth. There's probably been overall either flat. I think Omnicom as a whole over the 2 years is still down on the base year of 2019. The other 4 major holding companies, of us having really disappeared into Vivendi, probably grown a little bit more than that, probably about 2, 3 or 4%, with IPG being the best performer because probably it's a little bit more focused. But they are totally eclipsed by what we see happening in the digital part of the industry. In the digital part of the industry, we've seen growth over 2019. You take ourselves, our 2-year stacks are growing at around 65%, 70%. So this year, of course, obviously we're almost 50%. And last year we were 20%. So we've seen growth of 2/3 to 70% over the 2 years over 2019.
Are you a little bit concerned about the fact that the entire digital story globally is basically being pushed by three players, they being Google, Meta, and Amazon? And that kind of monopoly going forward seems to be only going to be strengthened, and it's not a good space to be, in the digital ecosystem.
Well, I think, first of all, there are 6 big players. I mean, there are 3 that you mentioned. There are 3 others, the 3 Chinese, Alibaba, Tencent, and TikTok. I mean, we've seen, which is part of ByteDance, we've seen a huge increase in interest and activity around TikTok. And let's get the numbers straight for a minute. It looks like the media industry will probably be about $650 billion to $700 billion this year. That includes traditional. Digital is more than half, probably around 55 to 60%, maybe even a little bit more. There is significant competition. We've seen the rise of TikTok. Mark Zuckerberg, when he launched Meta, the Metaverse, and the Meta rename for Facebook, the rebrand, did say that Snap were competitive, but TikTok in particular being highly competitive. And I think all the 6 platforms are starting to exert significant pressure on their operations to take into account the issues that you worry about: brand safety, privacy. All these issues are starting to come more and more to the fore, and all the platforms have made significant investments, incurred significant costs. Facebook, for example, has 35 to 40,000 people at least monitoring editorial content. As to regulation, there will be continued regulation. There will be continued fining of the platforms, but I don't think it will lead to a breakup of the platforms. I think what's happening is the platforms have to focus on organic growth. There is no way, we saw in the UK with Giphy that Meta is appealing against the CMA decision to deny them the Giphy acquisition. To me, it struck me as being a bit of an illogical decision. I mean, if the regulatory authority, the CMA in the UK, are saying, Meta, you cannot acquire anything, that's one. If that's the signal they should come out with. But to attack Giphy, I mean, what will happen is that the consumers, if they did put any restriction on Giphy, consumers would just use other platforms. There are significant other platforms they can use. So I think what you're going to see is more pressure on the platforms to conform around the areas of safety and privacy, quite rightly, and consumer consent, and then a restriction on their growth through acquisition. So they'll be using their profitability and they'll be using their resources to build their businesses organically. And we will get competition. I mean, we're seeing it in a way in the Metaverse and Web 3.0. We're heavily involved in the Metaverse with Meta, ex-Facebook. And we see that as tremendous opportunity for the gaming, the entertainment industry, e-commerce, for training. And the Metaverse will bring new competitors, NVIDIA, Roblox, all these companies, Epic, all these companies will become much more significant in terms of competitive activity. And I think Meta will have a very different competitive environment in the Metaverse. It's pushing it obviously extremely hard, but it will be much more competitive to what they were used to in the platforms.
Do you think the holding companies and several large established, traditionally rooted agencies who've now, of course, also taken the route of digitizing themselves, are prepared for what the Metaverse is going to offer, and what that world would look like, and what the role of advertising will be in that rather unique world?
The traditional holding companies' approach still is too siloed. They talk about having simplified their operations, but I actually think they've made them more complicated because they've entrenched the silos and the verticals. And what you really need is one firm. What you really need is a McKinsey or a Goldman Sachs, one brand operating as one to take advantage of these opportunities that you mentioned. being a little bit more specific or granular about it, one of the reasons why IPG probably has done better out of the 6 holding companies, or 5 if you exclude Havas, is that they do have much more focus around McCann, which prior to Axiom probably was about 2/3 of their operations. And therefore they've been able to focus a bit more and pull it together much more effectively than maybe the other holding companies. But even they, have struggled to find significant top line growth over the last 2 years.
Over the last few years, barring 2020, 2021, but I remember in Cannes, the big conversation was whether consulting companies such as Accenture are going to take over the business and cannibalize from what we hold very, piously called the creative industry, and that they were going to gnaw away at it. Is that actually happening? Are you seeing that happen? And how much of cannibalization has taken place, until now? That's
always been the case. And I think when I wrote the first annual report for WPP, which must go back to about 1986, 87, there was a section about the consultants companies eating our lunch. Now, it wasn't focused particularly on Accenture. I think Accenture is slightly different because it's done a superb job. I think the move, appointing David Droger as the head of Accenture Interactive instead of Brian Whipple, I think made a lot of sense as an attraction point. What Accenture has done is it's much more implementational. And the hard answer to your question, or the direct answer, is that the consulting companies do consult, obviously, on digital transformation, but they don't implement. So McKinsey and Bain and BCG and the others do a good job on the strategic side, sort of the PowerPoint presentations, if I'm being a bit cynical about it, but they don't implement. Where Accenture Interactive has really, and Accenture as a whole, because Accenture Interactive is 10 billion out of 50 billion or 55 billion, or whatever it is. What they've done extremely well is to implement effectively. And so they've done an extremely good job. And they're the only ones, really, I think, that have done it at scale. Buried inside Deloitte, I mean, we're talking to the people at Deloitte, they say that Deloitte Consulting is as big as or the same size as Accenture. I don't know whether that's true or not. If it is true, maybe the partners of Deloitte should spin off Deloitte Consulting as a separate company, because Accenture Interactive or Accenture has been extremely successful, and it span out of Arthur Andersen. But really, I think with those 2 exceptions, and we don't come into contact that much with Deloitte. In some geographical areas we do, maybe some areas of Asia Pacific, but generally we don't. Accenture itself is the competition, together with those tech companies that I mentioned, and that's where we see the big growth. And going back to the original questions you asked me about 21, 22, and 23, come 23, that's going to become really important, because all the fiscal stimulus impact will have been washed out of the system, if I can put it that way, by the end of 2022 or midway through 2023. Omicron has probably postponed that a little bit. It's pushed growth maybe into Q2 and Q3 and Q4 of next year. But by the end of next year, it'll be washed out. So the 2 engines that drive our business, GDP growth and digital transformation, the digital transformation engine will become the one that is paramount important. Now that you've said that and explained that quite clearly, we've been talking about holding companies changing shape and evolve, whether in the avatar that we currently see them or they splitting up and becoming more agile machines. We haven't seen any real movement there. We've seen some rumors about, holding companies being in talks with some venture capitalists, but nothing's come out of it. Where do you see holding companies heading in the future? Well, I think the only thing I've ever heard is that Publicis were talking to CVC about this time last year, and the deal, if there was a deal there, never happened. And I guess it is a bit of a puzzle as to why not so much venture VC, but private equity, which is so rampant and has more money than Croesus, and is probably accounts for about 15 to 20% of the economy, but of the marginal deals probably is a third, and they have huge influence and will have even greater influence, because a lot of people find operating in the public markets because of regulation singularly unattractive. So I think it's inevitable that private equity becomes more important, but they've been unwilling probably to take the risks that they see around the industry. And I think the reason, Sonali, is it comes back to where we started the conversation. They are not convinced that structurally the holding companies can make the adjustments necessary in the digital world. If there are two worlds, which there are, a traditional one and a digital one, the holding companies are the analogs. They're the dinosaurs. They're they're the analog dinosaurs that compete against the digital companies. And I think what the reason why private equity companies and activists have not, and there was an activist, Elliot, in IPG, but that really sort of fizzled out, really. I think they got out with their investment intact, but they really didn't make too much of an impact, surprisingly. But I think they found two things. One is it's a business that depends on people, but in my view, all businesses do, and we are no different. And the second thing is that they are worried about this structural problem, that the holding companies are so rooted. I mean, even in their wildest optimistic frame of minds, they will say 30-40% of their business is digital, which means 60 to 70% is analog. So go back to Group M's forecast for 2021. Why is it, if Group M is saying the industry is up 20%, the WPP can only grow, even with the fiscal and monetary stimulus, by 10%, and is losing share? And the answer is they have too much of their business in analog. And I think that's why the private equity companies and the activists are really not exercised. The companies are quite big in the context of what PE does, but there are some examples of big companies being taken out by PE companies of the size of a Omnicom or a Publicis or a WPP, who are around 15, 16, 17 billion US now. So I think it reflects the doubt that the major financial institutions, the investing institutions, have in the longevity of the model. So what do? They invest in digital businesses like our own, like S4, which have got stronger growth prospects, albeit from a smaller base, but have better prospects in terms of organic growth.
And I understand your point about the digital engine really growing globally, and that being the focus, that should be the focus and will be the focus. But how would you evaluate a country like India and its growth, and especially in context with the two planets we're talking about, traditional versus digital? Because like the rest of the world, we also saw a big comeback of TV because of the pandemic. Of course, our newspaper business suffered because they could deliver the newspapers. But we did see some big rebounds in TV, which we've never seen before. So you think that is temporary?
I do think it's temporary, and I think the digital march will continue. And I think India is in a really interesting position. I mean, in our own case, 70% of our business in North and South America, 20% in EMEA, and 10% in Asia Pacific. And our objective is to be 40-20-40. And the reason is we believe in the long-term future, particularly of Asia Pacific. We also believe in Eastern Europe. We also believe in Africa and the Middle East. We also believe in Latin America, but we really believe that the primary growth, that this is Asia Pacific's time. India will benefit, in my view, from the current tensions that regrettably exist between the US and China, and India will increasingly become an alternative, I think, in many clients' minds, not just India, to be fair. Countries such as Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Philippines, etc., Malaysia, all these countries offer alternative opportunities for our clients in a world where people are worried about political conflict and political disagreements. So in that world, for that reason, and also because China and India leapfrogged the sort of desktop revolution, if you like, went straight to smartphones. So the adoption of digital technologies in China and in India have been faster and I think fitter than many other countries. I mean, people always point to the UK as being a wonderfully digital economy, which is true, and it has done well from that point of view. But I think the things that we see going on in both China and India are the forerunners of what we see happening elsewhere. And because of these tensions that exist, political tensions that exist, I think India is in an extremely strong position to take advantage of it. And of course, you have your domestic entrepreneurs who you know well, who have done phenomenally well, not just in the Indian economy, but as they've ventured forth outside India too. So I'm very bullish on India, always have been. We have a good operation in India, but it's too small in my view. We should be a much more significant operation. We will become more and more significant. We're growing extremely fast in India, but we want to do bigger things, and I think there's tremendous potential.
I wanted your view on what we call Meta now has been going through, the entire saga of the whistleblowers, the fact that they've been trying to rebuild their narrative. They've even rebranded themselves. Of course, they don't say it's because they would try to do some reputation management, but it's all very clear that whatever they try, they're still being looked at as the wicked company run by a wolf.
I think that's unfair.
No, I'm just telling you about perception.
Perception is reality, as you well know, and or certainly in our world it is. But they are making strenuous efforts, as I mentioned before. They have invested huge amounts, and there are people like Scott Galloway that want to take even more heinous action against Mark Zuckerberg and indeed others inside the company. But I think they are making strenuous efforts. I think they are now hindered or hampered by the fact that they can't make acquisitions. So they are going to have to, in terms of capital allocation, either return money to shareholders or invest money in the business. They're not going to be able to acquire stuff. And that means they're going to have to do a lot more on the organic growth area. And I think that will be good. I think that will encourage more competition. And in areas such as the Metaverse, which Microsoft will be a big player in, you saw Microsoft buy Xandr. I think that's a really, from AT&T, or announced that. I think it's a really interesting move by Microsoft. Google's move on third-party cookies was extremely astute. It might have caused some short-term turbulence to their business and others, but in the long term, it means that clients will have to use the signals from the platforms, their first-party data, which all of our clients are really heavily focused on, trying to build their first-party data sources into coherent data lakes that they can use together with the signals of the platforms to develop relationships with you and I as consumers. So data-driven techniques, such as we do at S4, around content and around digital planning and digital media buying, are becoming increasingly important. But going back to your question, look, they have come in for heavy criticism, not just Facebook, but others too. But they are either being forced to, or by making their own decision to, they're doing things about it. It's very difficult for them. They have very strong positions, as I outlined with the numbers. I mean, you look. One thing I didn't say: the investment by our clients in Google, in Facebook, in Meta, in Amazon, and in TikTok, probably this year alone, was an incremental $100 billion out of a market probably of around 700 billion. So 1/7, about 15%, actually incremental investment. So those people that said they're suffering, and those people who said the market's against them, just look at the numbers. The numbers never lie, and it's really interesting to see what's happening. And I think that will be reflected again in 2022. I think you'll see very significant increases in the investment in platforms with platforms such as TikTok, with platforms such as Snap and Twitter, but particularly Snap probably, and TikTok showing greater growth.
Great. On that note, thank you so much. Thank you for your time, Martin. Always a pleasure speaking with you, and all the best for 2022.